Good morning and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Bill Benson. I am the host of the museum's public program, First Person. Thank you for joining us. We began our 17th year of the First Person program just yesterday. Our first person today is Mr. Manny Mandel, whom we shall meet shortly. This 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the generosity of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation with additional funding from the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation and the Helena Rubinstein Foundation. We are grateful for their sponsorship. First Person is a series of weekly conversations with survivors of the Holocaust who share with us their firsthand accounts of their experience during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serve as volunteers here at this museum. Our program will continue twice weekly through mid-August. The museum's website at www.ushmm.org provides information about each of our upcoming first-person guests. Anyone interested in staying in touch with the museum and its programs can complete the Stay Connected card that's in your program or speak with a museum representative at the end of the program. In doing so, you will receive an electronic copy of Manny Mandel's biography so that you can remember and share his testimony after you leave here today. Manny will share with us his first-person account of his experience during the Holocaust and as a survivor for about 45 minutes. If time allows, at the end of the program, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask Manny some questions. The life stories of Holocaust survivors transcend the decades. What you are about to hear from Manny is one individual's account of the Holocaust. We have prepared a brief slide presentation to help with his introduction. Manny Mandel was born to a religious Jewish family on May 8, 1936, in Riga, Latvia. Manny was just 3 when World War II started in 1939. Although he was born in Riga, Latvia, Manny's family were Hungarian Jews. They had moved briefly to Latvia because of his father's work. Here we see a portrait of Manny's parents, Yehuda and Ella Mandel, holding their infant son, Manny. Shortly after Manny's birth, his father accepted a post as a chief cantor in Budapest, and the family returned to Hungary, where they had lived in 1933. Hungary is highlighted on this map of Europe. And on this map of Hungary, Budapest is highlighted in yellow. Manny's father was based at the renowned Rambach Synagogue. In this picture, we see Manny and his father on a street in Budapest. The Hungarian government passed anti-Jewish laws beginning in 1938. In 1940, Hungary joined the Axis alliance, and in 1941, Hungarian troops participated alongside German troops in the invasion of the Soviet Union. The war and increasing restrictions made life for Jews in Hungary increasingly difficult. The photo on the left shows Manny outside his apartment on his first day of school in 1942 in Budapest. On the right, we see a contemporary photo of Manny standing outside the same apartment. German forces occupied Hungary in March 1944. Manny and his mother, Ella, were fortunate to be included in a program in which Jews would be transported to Palestine in exchange for trucks. Within months, they were transported by the Nazis to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Hanover, Germany, in preparation for the eventual departure from Europe. This is a historical photo of Bergen-Belsen. Negotiations for their transport to Palestine broke down, and in December 1944, about 6 months before the end of the war, Manny and his mother were released from the Bergen-Belsen camp and transported to safety in neutral Switzerland. There they stayed at the Haydn Children's Home, pictured here, where Ella worked as a teacher. Manny is lying down in the front on your left, and his mother, Ella, is standing in the back in the middle. After the war, Manny and his mother reunited with his father in Israel. They subsequently emigrated to the United States and lived in Philadelphia. Manny is a graduate of Temple University and did his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a clinical social worker. He met his future wife, Adrienne, in Philadelphia, and they were married in 1958. They have been married 58 years. After working for the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization in Cleveland and in Michigan, Manny and Adrienne moved to Washington, D.C., where Manny became the National Program Director for B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. He would later go to work for the Peace Corps before beginning his own psychotherapy practice in 1980. Manny retired from his practice in 2014. Adrienne's many accomplishments include having served in the Maryland legislature as an elected member of the House of Delegates, She is the immediate past president of the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, the nation's 8th largest water and wastewater utility. Adrienne retired from the Water Authority just in 2014. I might also mention Adrienne and I served for many years on the board of directors for the Center for Global Aging at Catholic University of America. Manny and Adrienne live in Silver Spring, Maryland. They have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Their daughter Lisa's 26-year-old son, Zachary, graduated from the University of Maryland, and her 24-year-old daughter, Gabrielle, graduated from the University of Michigan and is now a graduate student at John Jay University in New York. Manny and Adrienne's son, David, has a 19-year-old daughter, Alexandra, who has been at the summer Bolshoi Ballet program at Juilliard in New York. She graduated from high school in 2015 and now attends George Washington University. I'm pleased to say that Manny's wife, Adrienne, their son and daughter, and their nephew, Louis, are here with Manny today, all in the front row. They are also joined by their good family friends, Christine Bishop from Chicago and Tom McIntyre, who also is a volunteer here at the museum. Manny speaks regularly about his Holocaust experience in various settings, such as schools and synagogues. He volunteers at the museum, leading museum tours for school and law enforcement groups. Manny celebrates his 80th birthday on May 8th. He may say a bit about the significance of that date a little bit later. And with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming our first person, Mr. Manny Mandel. On the right.
Your right?
My right, yes. Okay. Manny, thanks so much. Yes. Thanks so much for joining us and for being willing to be our first person today. I know you've got a busy week. You're speaking again here at the museum tomorrow, I understand. You have so much to share with us in a limited time, so we'll get right to it. You were born in Riga, Latvia, as I mentioned earlier, in 1936, but your family stay there, and certainly yours was a short one before you moved to Budapest. War began in Europe when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, when you were just 3 years old. Let's start first with you telling us a little bit about your family, your parents, and your life before the war, before the Holocaust began.
You need to know that there is something unique about Hungary, not us, but Hungary and the Nazi government. You need to know, if you don't know, that only 2 countries in Europe basically were in a different situation than all the others. Specifically, Hungary was an ally of Germany. As a consequence, the Jewish community of Hungary had a different experience than the Jewish community of Poland. It's a very significant difference in that we did not have any occupation by Germans. The Germans don't arrive in Hungary in person, until 1944. And you know how late in the war that is, because the war ends in 1945. So that for the first years of the war, from 1938, 39, through the early 40s, our difficulties come not so much from the Nazis, but from the war itself. Bombings every night, other kinds of things, and certain restrictions that the government, in fact, was able to manipulate. We're under the rule of the Hungarian Nazi Party, but that's different than being under the rule of the German Nazi Party. So let me just suggest that our experience early is war-related more so than Holocaust-related.
But in that short period, beginning in March 1944, it was an extraordinarily horrific time, and we'll turn to that. So your family life and your family before the war. You told me a significant story that your mother shared with you along the lines of someone saying one day, well, today you now speak Yugoslavian. What was significant about that?
Well, that's before my time. That's really after the First World War. After the First World War, Hungary is truncated, and some of it becomes Yugoslavia, some of it becomes Czechoslovakia. My mother was raised in the Hungarian part of Yugoslavia, which is southern Hungary, northern Yugoslavia. She was a school kid, I guess maybe 10 years old, or 10 or third grade, and that's when the war ended, First World War, 1919 or so, and one day the teacher comes in and says, when you come back to school next Monday, we're going to switch language from what we've been teaching you in Hungarian to Serbo-Croatian. Now, Serbo-Croatian have about as much in common as the moon and earth. But they were bilingual. There was no problem in that situation. But Yugoslavia was created, so let's use the Yugoslav language, which is Serbo-Croatian. The family, my mother's family, her brothers and sisters, and her grandparents maintained Hungarian in the home. But in school, it was in fact in Serbo-Croatian, which I don't speak. I probably know 6 words. At one time, I may have known 20.
Manny, your father was an important cantor in Budapest. Tell us how he got to that position.
My father, well, the shorter version is the fact that my father, at some point, after serving in a Czech army, he was drafted because this was not Czechoslovakia, he was able to get to Vienna. My father had a magnificent voice all his life, and he was able to get into a cantor's school, which was world-renowned at the time, in Vienna. And when he graduated from that school, he wanted to have a job in Hungary, with his hopes being a cantor in Budapest. Now, for those of you who don't know, the cantor in the Jewish community is the one who leads the services, and there's lots of music involved, and choirs involved, and so forth. My father wanted to, in fact, be in Budapest, which is to him the New York Yankees or the Metropolitan Opera of the cantorate. Now, he was unable to get working papers in Budapest, because he had been a Czech citizen, having served in a Czech army, not by his own choice. So he looked around Europe, and he was able to find a very interesting and a very important position in Riga. Now, we have no Latvian connection, no Latvian family. We knew nobody in Latvia, certainly I didn't. And they were then ready to come back to Budapest, because they did get an appointment to Budapest in 1936. They waited for me to arrive, and as soon as I arrived, within weeks literally, we moved to Budapest. I can tell you that my father, some years ago, my father was still alive. My wife and I went to Riga for a weekend visit to see the city. It's a nice place. My father said to me, look up Pasta Jela Seche. That's Post Street 6, which was their address. That was the only Latvian he knew. We visited, the building was there. It was a very enjoyable weekend.
Your father, in his journey to becoming the cantor in Budapest, there were several important decision points that he had earlier in his life. One of them, I think, was when he was in the army wanted him to sing for them.
It's one of my favorite kind of warm, kind of and fuzzy stories. My father's drafted into the Czech army. Now, the Czech army, as many armies do, have various musical kinds of things, and it was some kind of an anniversary of the Czech something. So they put on an opera. For those of you anything about a man by the name of Bedřich Smetana, who was a Bohemian composer, he wrote an opera called The Bartered Bride. And they want my father to sing the lead. There were several problems involved. My father could not read music. My father had never seen an opera. My father did not know Czech well enough. But he had a good brain, and he was able to be coached almost like a trained ape of sorts, and be pushed on the stage, do his thing, and he did reasonably well. Based on that experience, the commanding musician of the whatever suggested that they have a deal for him. The deal is, after his army service, which they will cut a little short, if he is acceptable, and if it's acceptable to him, they'll send him to Prague, to the conservatory, to study music and to study voice, to become an opera singer. My father didn't know what to do. He couldn't approach his father with this kind of a question. He was reluctant. So he called on his uncle, my grandmother's brother, who was a lawyer, and he called the uncle, who was kind of the consigliere of the family, to go talk to his father. And the uncle, my great uncle, goes to talk to his brother-in-law, and has a conversation, and comes back to my father and says, "This is what your father said." He said, now you have to understand where they're living and what the background is. And a very religious family. My grandfather said, I never knew my grandfather. He died years before I was born of smoking. But in any case, he says, I have 7 children. If my son, Yehuda, goes to sing in the opera and violates the Sabbath and things of that nature, I'll have 6 children. Thus ended my father's operatic career.
And he
did a lot of concertizing and sang a lot, great deal of opera. If those of you know opera, he would have been a perfectly good Verdi tenor, whatever that's to you.
And one of the other decision points, as I recall, Manny, is that he had opportunities to be a cantor elsewhere, including, I think, London, other places than Hungary. Did he ever later express, in light of what happened to the family, did he ever express regret about not having taken one of those positions?
Yes and no. He did not express any kind of resentment about not taking the positions because his goal in life was to be in Budapest. And the other side of the coin is he said, had I taken the position in London, we would have escaped the Holocaust. Interesting, the synagogue where he was, in those days people went on various kinds of, what they called them probes. There were auditions. And one was in the Duke's Place Synagogue in London, which was bombed out during the war. But in any case, had he taken that, the whole Holocaust experience for the family and perhaps for other members of the family would have been avoided.
Absolutely.
But who knows tomorrow?
Manny, while, as you said to us earlier, while the full force of the war itself and the Holocaust did not hit your community in Hungary until the spring of 1944, there still were many difficulties for you once the war was underway in Europe, beginning in fall 1939. Tell us about the circumstances of your family and what you may recall yourself, being as young as you were, from those first few years of the war before it really came to Hungary.
Because I was as young as I was, and because of the circumstances in which we lived, I described the fact that I lived very much in a bubble. I was well protected from much of this. I knew about many things, I recall them, I can describe them. I did not get the impact of the effect that I would have had I been 5 or 8 years older. As a matter of fact, if I had been 5 or 8 years older, the chances are I wouldn't be here. But I was very well protected, but I saw things. I was very surprised and kind of upset in a way that when we saw the Hungarian soldiers on the street and knew that they were allied with the Germans, my parents were upset with that. I couldn't understand that. And I understand this is a 5- and 6-year-old talking. Why don't they root for the home team? I don't know if you folks are all from Washington, but wherever you're from, the football team of your community is the one that you root for, not the enemy. In Washington, we don't root for Dallas. We root for Washington. So I didn't understand why my parents were rooting not for the local team, but for the Allies. That's difficult for a kid to understand. After all, you have to have your own local heroes. Other things began to happen. The Hungarian numerous clauses, which were the restrictive laws, were passed in Hungary until in the 20s, not the 30s. You may know that in the 30s, the German Nuremberg laws came out. But the Hungarian laws were passed in the 20s, after the First World War, but were not really enforced until much later, maybe 10, 12 years later in the late 30s. So as a consequence of that, from 1940 or so, my father was conscripted into the labor battalions. Hungarian men were drafted into the army and fought in Russia. Hungarian Jews were not drafted into the army, but into labor battalions to backfill those positions that Hungarian men had, which had to do with some farming and some mining and some crater repair and some railroad repair and road repair. And my father was perhaps like a traveling salesman, out of the house and in the house. After a while, it was normal for him not to be home. But from 42 to 44, I saw him infrequently. I did see him, but infrequently. He would get a call or a visit or a letter that said on Tuesday at 3 o'clock, you will be at such and such a railroad station to be gone for a day, a week, or an indeterminate period of time. He'd be home for a day, out for a week, home for a week, out for a day, always in territorial Hungary. You saw the map before. Hungary is not that big. You can get almost anywhere in a couple of hours by train. So I had very limited contact with him at that time.
Tell us what the arrow cross was.
The arrow cross is the symbol, crossed arrows, is the symbol, as opposed to the swastika, is the symbol of the Hungarian Nazi Party. Now that's a political party. In Germany, it was a political party that was heavily impacted, had heavy impact on the army and the government. In Hungary, it wasn't such an army and had less impact, but it was the ruling philosophy of major anti-Semitic nature.
And as the anti-Semitism began to really increase, more and more restrictions were imposed on Jews in Hungary. What were some of the restrictions that you recall?
Well, here again, the restrictions on a kid were very limited. let me say it in two parts. Part one would be that the air raids that happened once, twice, three times a night were of major impact. Even I could understand that the next morning when I go to school, the building next door to me may be gone. There was significant damage in Budapest, as we were bombed early by the Russians and then later by the Allies coming from two directions. But most of the other things had no impact on me specifically, in that, for example, there were restrictions in jobs, restrictions in some travel, restrictions on what you couldn't do, where you couldn't shop. But I didn't do the shopping, so I would not have been bothered by that in any direct sense.
You told me I thought, a very poignant story, in that as a kid, like any kid, you wanted a bicycle, but your father wouldn't let you have one.
Well, on one of the times when my father was home, I approached him and I said, I'd like to have a new bicycle. I had a trike, kind of an overgrown tricycle, but I said I'd like to have a bike, maybe not a full-size bike, but maybe an 18-inch size one that I could ride. My father said there are two reasons that block that possibility. One I can handle, but one I will not. What I can handle is that I said to you folks that I lived in an apartment building on the 5th floor, which was 50 years old. It had an elevator, which was also 50 years old. And on many occasions, that elevator had parts that would break down, and the parts that were there to replace them were manufactured in factories that were doing munitions and guns and stuff. And elevator parts for my building were kind of low on the priority list. So it was out of service perhaps as much as it was in service. When we had to go to air raid shelters every night, 5 stories down, 5 stories up. He said, and I could not carry a bike 5 stories down because in European cities you ride the bike in a park, not in your backyard, which you don't have. He said he would do that, maybe a little difficult, but he was a strong gentleman in his 30s, so he would truck the bike down and truck it back up. But there was a second problem. By this time, all of us, one of the restrictions was they wore a yellow star to be identified. I thought the star was a major mark of heroism because after all, here I was 6 years old or 7, and I wore a star just like the adults did. I then discovered, and it was through this bicycle experience I began to discover that this was not so much a mark of heroism, but a target that could be attacked in some way. My father said to me, if we go to the park and you ride the bike with your yellow star, and you're out of my sight for 12 seconds, somebody might have the notion, because it happened in other places, to whack you on the head. Not to steal the bike. They don't want the bike. They just want to whack you on the head. Because here is a target with the yellow star, and it's open season on these kinds of things. And for that reason, you will not have a bike. I was very upset, but I began to understand that this heroism notion of a yellow star to identify me as a Jew was not a mark of heroism, but a mark of a targeting for possible mayhem. That was a particular experience that began to teach me what's going on. I can add that when we came to this country in 1949, I was 13 years old, and one of the very first things my parents did when I came home from school one day said, we're going to the department store. Some people don't have anymore. And what are we going to buy? A bicycle. So I had and I treasured that bicycle. I think it lived with me in my bedroom, polished it 4 times a day. It was with me for years. It was a Schwinn, for those of you old enough to remember Schwinn bicycles.
Manny, during that period, were you able to go to school? What was school like?
I went to a parochial school, to a Jewish day school, which happened to have been 3 or 4 blocks from my house. Our apartment was on a corner of 2 streets, this one, and my parents' bedroom was on a corner, and from the bedroom window you could see the school. Maybe 4 blocks away or 3 blocks away. Yet, I'm told that on many occasions, perhaps every day, somebody would follow me to school. Because that yellow star in 1st grade was an absolute invitation to be whacked on the head. Again, they're not going to rob me of my money or my wallet or my driver's license, but they were going to whack me on the head because there was open season on that kind of mayhem. And it did happen. Not to me, but it did happen.
In December 1941, your family had a truly horrifying experience while you were visiting your aunt in another city. Tell us about that.
That was my very first experience beginning to understand, particularly in recollection, what this thing was all about. I'm 5.5 years old in the winter of 41. Now, as I said to you, my mother grew up in northern Yugoslavia, which was southern Hungary. And my grandparents and my aunts lived there. My mother had 2 sisters. and 3 brothers, but they were no longer living there. In any case, we go down to a city called Novi Sad. In those days, many cities had multiple names because it depends on what country they belonged in a given time. Novi Sad is a Serbian name for a place called Ujvidek in Hungarian, and Neustadt in German, who was part of Austro-Hungary. We go there by train. It's about 3.5 hours south of Budapest by train, and we stay at my aunt's house, my mother's younger sister. And it's very nice. I don't recall exactly what we did, although I do recall that my aunt's husband had a cork factory, and I was taken to the factory to be given a tour, and it was interesting to see what kind of products they make out of cork. I'm not sure that's significant. The uncle died in labor camp, and the factory went. One morning, perhaps 2 or 3 days after we're there, somebody comes up the stairs and says, there's something going on the street. Within 5 minutes or so, 2 policemen come up, go no, knock, knock, and say to us, ladies and gentlemen, you need to dress warmly because you have to be outside. We have to do a census. Now, it's winter. It's not bitter, but it's winter and it's cold. The Germans, or the Hungarians, but the ruling government was going to count the Jews every 20 minutes, I think. Now, a census in this country do every 10 years. They did it with great frequency on the assumption, perhaps a correct one, that if you count people and know where they are, you can control their movement and what they do and where they are. So we were told to come outside, my mother, my father, my aunt, and we're on the street, on the sidewalk. We're told to turn left and to start walking in that direction. We had no idea why. We walked for some time, a couple, 3 hours maybe. I know that my mother carried me, my father carried me, and I also walked. I was 5.5 years old. I was a little guy. We arrived at a place that I recognized. On our left, on our right was the major street, and on our left was an 8-foot stockade fence. Now, for those of you who may have been in Europe, and you may know this, European cities which are not on the ocean or a big lake use rivers to make beaches out of them in the summertime. This city is on the Danube River, south of Budapest. It flows from Germany into the Black Sea, through Budapest and Yugoslavia. I remembered the place because that summer, perhaps 2 months or 3 months before, I'd been there. And inside the fence, or by maybe 300 yards away from the fence, are hot pools and cold pools and wave pools and thermal pools and restaurants and amusement parks. Very, very nice place in the summertime. This is December. The place is shut down because this is not beach weather. As we are marching, kind of walking slowly, my grandparents had arrived. There's somebody brought them by truck. And we were huddled together, perhaps a dozen people or so. And we were walking slowly in this direction, again, in the direction where, and we noticed that the gates to this place, these big stockade gates, are open when people make a left turn towards the river. We still have no idea what's going on. There's some noise which was later identified, but we didn't know it. As we get somewhat closer, I don't know how far we were at this point, 50 feet, 100 yards, a policeman is standing on the right, and he says to my father, "Mister, what are you doing here?" My father says to him, "I'm here with my family." He said, "Well, it's fine. That's not the point. The point is that I know that you don't live here. You live in Budapest, and I know that because I'm a foot patrolman in your district, and I've seen you on the street any number of times, so I know that you live there. So being here and with this group of yours being counted in this crowd would mess up the numbers. Can't do that. Step aside." My father and my mother and our little group of the steps aside. I'm sure as a matter of absolute coincidence, as we're stepping aside literally, or a minute or two later, literally a minute or two, a staff car comes down the road, a uniformed soldier comes out, has a powwow with his buddies, gets on the bullhorn and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the requirements of the census have been met. There's a school over there. You're welcome to go there and get some hot coffee or hot chocolate. Go home." If you're bewildered, can you imagine how bewildered we are? We went home, back to my aunt's house. No idea what happened, but the phone calls begin to come in. We still had phones. My other aunt calls and says, "Where were you all day? We had some plans." And we tell her, and she says, "That's interesting." 7:30 in the morning, 2 policemen came to my door and said they have to do a census. So I did what I would normally do, and you would have to know my aunt to know this, and my family knew her, some of my family. My aunt invited them in and gave them coffee and cake. That means 17 cakes, 19 coffees, and a room full of dishes. They had the best breakfast coffee in their life. They asked 3 questions, and they left. And my aunt is saying, what's going on? And I didn't go to the beach. I didn't go to the stockade fence. That was her experience. The experience of those people who, in fact, made that left turn was a much more horrible one. The government, in fact, took cannon with which they cracked the ice in the Danube, which was yay thick. All those who, in fact, made a left turn were shot into the river, never to be found again, or if they were found floating underneath the ice in Belgrade, about an hour away, the next March, or whenever the river thawed out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a pogrom, a senseless, useless, valueless experience that people can do because they can do it and you can't stop them. Something had happened, and this was retribution for that, and 350 people were killed in the pogrom of Novi Sad of 1941. I didn't quite understand what that meant, but I can describe the story as I just did. The next morning, I only tell you this because there's something here I do remember, had meaning to me. My father calls for a taxi to go back to Budapest. Somehow, folks, when there's a catastrophe that you're in or it's around you, what you want to do is go home. Now, it was my grandparents and my aunt. I was perfectly safe. But home is not where this was. Home was in Budapest. My father calls for a taxi, and a 1-horsepower taxi showed up. Anybody guess what a 1-horsepower taxi can be? My daughter. She's cheating. A 1-horsepower taxi is a sleigh. It's wintertime. There's snow on the ground, 1 horse, and a taxi. And we went to the train station. There were regular taxis with engines in them as well. But this is what showed up at the particular time. And that's what I remember, because again, for a 5.5-year-old, that's an adventure. 350 people killed, it doesn't have that much meaning. But a sleigh, a horse-drawn sleigh to go to the train station is an adventure.
Manny, I'm going to have us jump now more than 2 years to March 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary, and of course things changed profoundly, dramatically, and almost instantly. Tell us what brought the Germans in at that stage, because they hadn't occupied Hungary up until that point, and then what happened from there?
In 1942 in Berlin, at a place called Wannsee, which is a villa, it has no significance. There was a conference called by a man by the name of Heydrich, who was the chief SS officer, a general in the Eastern Front of the German War. He called for a conference where they came up with the particulars for the final solution to the Jewish problem. It's a phrase that you should know. Obviously, the final solution was extermination. And they appointed a man to be the mechanic or the person who in fact runs this project, this issue. His name was Adolf Eichmann. Some of you may know the name. I'll get to some stories about him a little bit later. But Eichmann, in fact, does a very effective job. He is a mid-level officer in the German army, a lieutenant colonel, and he, in fact, clears the Jews from all of the countries of Europe and sends them to various extermination and concentration camps. You know some of the names of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Chelmno and Majdanek and so forth. Since Hungary is an ally of Germany, he does not come to Hungary. He comes to Hungary, well, it doesn't come then. He comes to Hungary last. Now, 44, March of 44, is very, very late in the war. You remember the D-Day is June of 44. The war is over in May of 45. So this is, if you want to talk in terms of, again, a football context, this is fourth quarter. He comes to Budapest on the 19th of March, 1944. Now, the significance there, incidentally, is the fact that today, I asked the people in the museum, why did they ask me to do first person today? It's of no consequence to me, I'm available. They said because the 17th of March today is not in reminiscence to St. Paddy's Day, but rather it's in reminiscence to the fact that the Germans came to Budapest, where I was, on the 19th. It's as close as they could come. They couldn't have billed to a first person on the 19th. Not quite, right?
I would have done it had I been asked.
Okay. But in any case, on the 19th of March, Eichmann arrives. As soon as he arrives, as soon as some issues happen, the deportations from Budapest begin at the rate of 12,000 a day. Now, I don't know where you folks are from, but often when we speak to groups, we find people from smaller communities where 12,000 represents the whole city or the whole town, or that represents their school. And that was the size of the deportation, beginning immediately within days of the 19th of March, 1944.
What happened to your family when Eichmann and the Germans arrived? What prompted them to come into Hungary at that point?
Well, it was the last one that had not yet been cleared.
But also there had been some political change in Hungary, right?
That was perhaps the least significant of the reason. They were coming as a consequence, and in relation to that, the Allied connection with Germany ceased. And Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary, was no longer in charge, and the charge came directly from the Hungarian fascist government, the Arrow Cross. Mm-hmm. But what happened to us was that almost as soon as Eichmann arrives, two men from kind of a self-generated rescue committee, as they call themselves, insist on approaching Eichmann. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand, you don't just go up to the Majestic Hotel and you say, I want to talk to Colonel Eichmann. I mean, I'm not trying to compare the two, but if I was in Rome and I wanted to see the Pope, I couldn't quite walk up to the Vatican and say, I want to see the Pope. These people insisted, and thank God they did. The leader of this twosome was a Hungarian Jewish attorney from the Romanian part of Hungary, the city of Cluj, called Kolozsvárosváros, again, multiple names, who began to discuss with Eichmann a proposition that is about as ridiculous as it can be. This was it. If Eichmann will release 1 million Jews from the various camps, they will supply him with 10,000 trucks with certain materiel, tea, coffee, and other kinds of things for the German war. Now, the problem was manyfold, besides the fact that it couldn't happen. But the point was Eichmann did not have 1 million people to release. There were no 1 million people there anymore. Most had been killed. And secondly, these guys had about as much opportunity to have 10,000 trucks. Well, they did have a bicycle pump or a hubcap, not 10,000 trucks.
So it was a completely audacious proposal.
Absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
And they all knew it. One of the two, in fact, is sent through Turkey to go to Egypt to talk to the British High Command to discuss trucks. He's arrested in Syria, spends the rest of his war in jail in Cairo as a spy, survives the war, but nothing happens. The point of this absurdity, at least, was the beginning of a possibility. Mm. The negotiations continued and continued, and do understand that these negotiations did not begin and end with Eichmann. They went all the way up to Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was number 3 in the German government. There was a man by the name of Hitler, a man by the name of Goering, and a man by the name of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Now, I'm not saying he was directly involved, but the whole thing had to do with the fact that the Nazi government leadership kind of smelled the fact that the issues of the war were not going in their favor. This was around D-Day already. The only last instance of any success on their part was the Battle of the Bulge. But the point was they kind of smelled the end. They were looking to find ways to, in some way, do something for their life after the war. As a sidebar, I will tell you that Eichmann, in fact, is not arrested. Well, he is arrested, but he also escapes. And he winds up, anybody know where he wound up? Eichmann? He was there captured by the Israeli Secret Service many years later. In Argentina. And although he didn't necessarily go to Argentina with our valuables that were collected because the trucks could not be made available. Money was collected, significant money from all over the world, for a group of 1,700 people to be taken in a 35-car train from Budapest. I'll tell you about that in 1 minute. But to finish Eichmann and his henchmen and the others, in fact, are able to use these valuables to establish lives for themselves. Eichmann, you may not know, but you might know the most famous doctor in Auschwitz, Dr. Mengele, who did all the experimentation. He too winds up in Argentina. Eichmann was captured, he was taken to Israel, tried and hanged. But the point is, that's how these people found their ways, and many others did whom we never found after the war, with the kind of stuff that they were collect for these 1,700, approximately 1,700 people. The selection of these 1,700 people was a very complex issue. Everybody in Hungary, certainly, who ever had any interest in that land over there called then Palestine, which became Israel, held various kinds of certificates for contributions made to the Jewish National Fund. This is an organization that exists to this day, which bought land on which settlements could be started in the early 1900s and through the 20s and the 30s. And for reasons that I cannot explain, the German government accepted these certificates as proof of our being displaced persons during the war, and they served as exit visas
For this 1,700.
for this 1,700
Yeah.
group.
Yeah.
Folks, if you ever have seen a $3 bill, this is one of them, a $3 bill. We were to be taken to a neutral port and dispatched from Europe, because Hitler's position was to get Jews out of Germany, out of Europe, and then out of the world. He didn't get to the third part. Mm-hmm. We were placed on in this train of 35 cars, 1,700 people, maybe 50 or 60 people to a car, depending, and transported north. The leadership of this group did not know where we were going and which port we were going to. As it happens, we found ourselves not far from Hanover, in a concentration camp, not a killing camp, a concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen. We were told this is to be a 3-day R&R, rest and recuperation stop, before we boarded the ships. After 6 weeks of R&R, about 350 people were taken out by the Germans as part of the negotiations and taken to Switzerland. Guess what? I wasn't one of them. I stayed a full 5.5 months, at which one I too, and my mother and my uncle was with us.
So your father was not with you?
No. I'll talk about that in a second. My mother, my uncle and I, my father's youngest brother and I, were in fact taken out of Germany by German troop train this time, rickety old troop trains, then taken to Switzerland. My war was over at that time. This is in December 1944. The war ends on May the 8th, 1945, and I'll comment about that if Bill wishes a little later. Mm-hmm. My father is in labor camp, as he had been from 42 on, here up on and off, and could not because he didn't have the choice of joining us. Had he been able to join us, we would have found space for him. He thus survived the war. We meet later in 1946. So from 42 to 44, I see him intermittently. From 44 to 46, I don't see him at all. So when we met after those 4 years, we kind of had to reestablish a relationship, because there's a difference with being 8 and being 12, or 7 and 11, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So we did meet up.
What were your conditions like, because you were part of a select group, if you will, in Bergen-Belsen?
Because we're part of the select group, we're also the golden eggs laid by the geese. In other words, we were the barter group. We were the hostages. If they killed us, they would have nothing to negotiate with. I mean, they would not have gotten the monies, which were given in staggered portions, in suitcases. The valuables here were things you could carry in a suitcase. Money was not an issue, because the only valuable money that existed in Europe then were the American dollars and the British pound sterling, which nobody had. But jewelry of every kind, and gold and silver, diamonds, rubies, and whatever else, which have value, intrinsic value, were the barter, were the negotiations funds that were used. If, in fact, they had begun to kill us, or killed us totally, which they could have done, they would not have been able to get this, and that would have been of a disaster for them. As a consequence, although we had all the amenities that Bergen-Belsen provided, we did not go to work. Now, an 8-year-old wouldn't have gone to work anyhow. But even the adults did not go to work. We were in these barracks, in these compounds. This was the Hungarian compound where we were all by ourselves. So there was the advantage of having a slightly easier life, but the difficulties of the kind of weather in Germany, the kind of daily senses we had to do, sometimes standing outside for 3 or 4 hours in the mud, the kind of no food or lack of food, which was typical for Bergen-Belsen. So the conditions, the sanitation situation was horrible. We had showers periodically, hot showers. And in those days, we didn't know that the hot showers were, in our case, hot water. And the case in Auschwitz was Zyklon gas. But what I'm saying is that the conditions in Bergen-Belsen were horrible, but tolerable in the sense that we survived.
I was struck when we first met and you told me about that part of your experience, that there were these attempts to really try to create a sense of normalcy in Bergen-Belsen, in the Hungarian compound. Say a bit about that.
Folks, the will to survive is a very powerful one. When we got to Bergen-Belsen, we had been told to pack some food and whatever for the journey to the boats, which we never got to. One of the things that some of us knew about, maybe all of us knew about, I don't mean I, but the adults, is that when you take tin cans and you use them, you can boil them and clean them and put fresh food in them and take them to a factory that we knew about which could reseal them so they would be in some way protected from botulism and things like that. My mother had some of these with her, and so did others. After we used the food as supplemental food and very carefully rationed, people decided that what they should do with these tin cans is not recycle them in a typical way that we recycle, but to cut them up and make jewelry out of it. Now you see, you take a tin can, the tin that you have, and you make earrings or bracelets or necklaces because you have the skill to do it. Now how you had tools to do it with, I'll never know. But other people, for example, had tools. The cobbler had shoemaking and repair tools. You could trade a pair of earrings for the repair of your shoes, which you could then trade for 2 cigarettes for something else. This kind of business and commerce began under the conditions of Bergen-Belsen strictly as a sign of survival. Nobody needed the jewelry. People needed the shoes repaired if they possibly could, or a haircut, and a half a dozen other kind of barterable kinds of things that you could do. And these are all attempts by the people there to in some way establish kind of a daily life for them that would be reminiscent of the time before this situation took place.
You got very ill while you were there, as I recall.
Everybody has 2 sets of lungs, but yeah, I had triple pneumonia. I don't know how you do that. The problem with pneumonia, which had to do with sanitation and being outside and bugs and so forth, the problem was that since there was no treatment available for it. Today we know that pneumonia is cured very quickly. First of all, you have pneumonia preventing vaccine shots. I just got my 2nd pneumonia shot 2 days ago because my doctor said I should. But the point is that there were no treatments then because the antibiotics, which were just being invented. I mean, Fleming came up with penicillin in the early 40s. And I guarantee you the first place it was tested was not in the concentration camps. So there was nothing they could do. We had about 35 physicians in the group. There's nothing they could do except diagnose, yes, you have pneumonia. And when you cough, it's going to be painful. All they could do is do some palliative medicine. That's medicine that makes you feel better but doesn't cure a thing. It lets the body cure itself. They use something called mustard plasters. Does anybody ever hear of mustard plasters in this room? My family can't talk. Well, you get some kind of heavy material, I don't know where they found it, and you get some mustard seed, and you soak it in water, and you soak this cloth in mustard, and you put it on. They put it on me like a dressing. Now, it functions as Bengay or Vicks. It heats the body. It makes you feel better. It doesn't cure the pneumonia, but while you have the pneumonia, it makes you feel better. That's why it's called palliative medicine, and they did that to me for about 6 weeks. And obviously I survived because the body cured itself, and then I was healthy from that time on. But for 6 weeks, I was flat on my back.
And as you told us earlier, in December of 1944, for you, the war was effectively over when you made it to Switzerland, to a neutral country. And as you also said, your father was not with you. Tell us where he was in the labor camps, but when he got out of the labor camps, what did he do when he returned to Budapest? And did he know anything about you?
Not when he returned. He returned to Budapest before Budapest's liberation, quote unquote, by the Russians, which was a peculiar kind of liberation. It eliminated the Nazis, but created some other problems, but not the kind of anti-Semitic problems as overt as they had been under the Nazis. My father's youngest brother was with us in camp. He was instrumental in getting us into that group. His name was David, and my wife and I decided if we have a son, his name will be David, and David is sitting right over there. My father was, by the time that we left Hungary, he was no longer in territorial Hungary, he and his group were taken into the Ukraine for similar work. As it came to be the fall of 1944, as the war was moving in reverse for the Nazis, their guards and their other kinds of restrictions were kind of not lifted, but they disappeared. My father and I, about 20 other men in his particular platoon, brigade, command, whatever it is, decided to just walk away. And they walked from the Ukraine back to Budapest. They walked at night, they slept during the day, they stole food wherever they could, they cooked the food in the exhaust of trucks that they could find. They did what they could to survive. My father's back in Hungary, and the Nazis are still there. He had some peripheral affiliation with another noteworthy person of the time, a man by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. Some of you may know about Raoul Wallenberg, who also issued Swiss exit visas. He was a Swiss diplomat, and he issued these visas which were about as valuable as a $3 bill. But the Germans accepted them, and they used $3 bill again for the same reason. And those who could find a way to get out of Hungary, in fact, were able to survive because of Wallenberg's involvement. For those of you who came to the museum this morning, if you didn't come on a 14th Street side, but on a 15th Street side, which is where the plaza is, that's called Raoul Wallenberg Place. In honor of Raoul Wallenberg, the city of Washington permitted the museum to have a 2-block area of 15th Street renamed Raoul Wallenberg Place, Avenue, whatever it is, in honor of Raoul Wallenberg, who was very instrumental. My father had some peripheral contact with him. He found our apartment, and he was able to locate the man who was involved in negotiations, this Hungarian Jewish lawyer by the name of Rezső Kastner. He was able to, after some difficulties, to get Kastner to tell him that we were in fact in Bergen-Belsen, because the group, because of its special nature, was traceable through the Red Cross. They knew where we were, couldn't contact us. When we left Bergen-Belsen, and Bill already talked about the fact that we went from, in Switzerland, we were placed in a children's home, like a boarding school, and you saw a picture of it, because we had to be somewhere. My mother was employed by that school as a teacher. There were 20 Hungarian kids there, and she was assigned to that place because there had to be somebody there who spoke Hungarian to us and could speak German or French to the rest of the administration. My mother had very good German from school, and she had passable French. The leadership of the school, of the Haydn school, was a German Jew by the name of Müller, whom we later met in Philadelphia. But the point is, she was there. She was able to take some trips she was paid for a salary of some sort. She went to Zurich, and she looked up a colleague of my father's, a cantor, with whom my father studied in Vienna. As a Swiss citizen, he could make contact with Hungary. So my mother talked to Cantor Noy. Noy talked to my father, not talked, but corresponded with my father in Budapest. My father then responded to Noy. Noy talked to my mother. So that was the contact which at least established that we're all alive, and where we were. We couldn't go to where he was, and he couldn't come to where we were. He did say when the opportunity came up, we should come back to Hungary, which my mother refused. She said she'll never set foot in Hungary again, and she didn't. She decided that since the original notion of the trip was to go to Palestine on these boats, that's what she would do. She had no idea what Palestine was about, but that's what she would do. We did. And actually, we went to Palestine in September of 1945 on a British troop ship. The Brits ferried us to Palestine. We were living there. My father joined us there in 1946.
The war ended on a significant date.
You want my comments on that?
Yes, I do.
May the 8th has three very important reasons for existing. The war ended. It is the birthday of the President of the United States in that year. Do you recall who that was? It was not Roosevelt. Roosevelt died in April, and the president after 15 minutes becomes Harry Truman. Harry Truman was born May the 8th, 18 something or other, I don't know the year. So now we have the war ending on May the 8th, Harry Truman's birthday, and of course, as Bill told you, my birthday takes place on May the 8th. So the three important reasons for May the 8th celebration of the war, Harry and I.
So your family got reunited in Palestine, in Israel.
Right.
What did your family do to try to resume life?
My mother got a job being kind of a caretaker for a child. My father had a job as a cantor. And my father had a particular thought in life. My father came, as I said to you before, from a family of 7. 2 of the women died before I was born of various diseases in 1930 or 31. The third sister came to the United States in 1914. My grandfather, who was not very successful, decided that if my Aunt Helen, the oldest of his children, were to come to Philadelphia to live with a cousin, that would reduce his burden at home. And she did. She came to Philadelphia, married in Philadelphia, had 3 children, lived to be 90-some years old, and had a very nice life. But my father's one brother, his youngest brother, David, was with us. 2 other brothers died during the war. So my father decided that what he would like to do in 1947 is come to the States to visit his sister, whom we hadn't seen since 1914. It was such a long time that my eldest aunt never met my youngest uncle. He was born after she left. My father came to Philadelphia, visited with my aunt, and was able to make some arrangements, which was an idea that was suggested to him that maybe what he ought to do is stay here and bring us over, which eventually, after certain kinds of negotiations, he was able to do.
And how old were you when you arrived in the United States?
1913. I was 13.
You were 13. What was my last question of you before we have time for a few questions from our audience? 13 years old, all that you've been through in Hungary and then Switzerland and then to Palestine.
Which becomes Israel
and
while
becomes
there.
Israel while you're there.
I went from war to war.
And now you arrived in the United States. What was that like for you as a 13-year-old boy?
Well, besides it being fascinating and bewildering, it was also one more adjustment I had to make. And I'll tell you about one part of that adjustment. I mean, the subway in New York, which is where we lived for the first year, was not unusual. Budapest has the second oldest subway in the world. So I knew subway. Skyscrapers, Venetian blinds. There used to be chiclet machines in the subway stations. For a nickel, you put a nickel and got chick. That was very interesting. But the one thing that was a major adjustment was the fact that my English was literally non-existent. English was taught from the 5th grade on in Israel, in Palestine, until one day the teacher comes in. If you know something about the history, you know that the British were not our friends. The teacher comes in, who was trained in England, and says, okay, as of tomorrow, we are no longer going to study English. Terrific. We're going to study American. So my English and my American was not particularly strong, left a lot to be desired. Now, to arrive someplace and not know the language is difficult, and I can illustrate it by something, but there were bright people around. My parents were looking for a school. They thought of a parochial school. That didn't work out because they decided that because of my English, I should be in 3rd grade. Now, it's not the question of what grade you're in, but a 3rd grader and a 7th grader have very little in common in many ways. If you know anything about the development of people, the age of 3rd grade and the age of 7th is quite different. We then discovered that the apartment that we had sublet for the summer was a block away from PS number 3 in New York. For you New Yorkers, it's in the Village. It's off Hudson Street, which is the end of 8th Avenue, around St. Christopher's. We walked over to the school. My parents' English was not much better. My father was the best at it. He had been here for a year. We went and talked to the principal about what we're going to do. So he came up with a brilliant recommendation. But it was an adjustment. He said, okay, the kid's in 7th grade, right? Right. We'll put him in 7th grade. We had 7A and 7B. This is 7B. If he is able to pick up enough language and the time left in this 7B, we'll put him in 8th grade. If not, we'll keep him in 7th grade, which makes perfectly good sense. However, since we are teaching Spanish in 7th grade, we will excuse him from Spanish and give him an extra study hall so he can learn some more English. That was another adjustment I had to make.
And adjust you did. And here we are today in 2016.
Have I learned some English?
And very effectively. We have time for just 1 or 2 questions from our audience. If you have a question, we will have a microphone handed to you, so wait till you have a mic. If you will make your question as short as you can, and I'll repeat it just to be sure that all of us, including Manny and the audience, hears the question. So I think we can do 1 or 2 questions. So anybody have a question they'd like to ask?
Not all at once.
Yeah. We got one, I think. There's a hand right there. There we go. Thank you.
Do I need to stand up?
No, you're fine.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just trying to see you, that's all.
Sir, I don't know if you know anything about the rhetoric that was going on in Europe and Hungary and that kind of thing, in the 1930s or whatever, or if you studied those. Is there any similarities in the rhetoric against the Jews that went on then as to some of the rhetoric that seems to be happening in the United States today?
Do you want to repeat it? I heard it.
You heard it. They heard the question. To the extent if that you feel comfortable answering
It's
that.
a very difficult thing. First of all, I'm not an expert in it. I would say this. Unfortunately, rhetoric sounds similar. But the goals of the rhetoric are quite different. No place in the history of the world that I know of, and anybody in this room I would be willing to be challenged, can talk about the fact that rhetoric was designed for extermination. Now, there's an enormous difference between the goal being extermination and the goal being all kinds of other discriminatory acts, good, bad, and otherwise. So what I'm saying is the words may sound alike, but the goal of the words was unique to that period in time. And today's words don't have that as a goal. I hope I've responded as well as I could.
Thank you. Okay, I think we may have one more
I
question.
can hardly see you, but there you are.
Yeah, so the lights are so bright
Well,
for us, hard to see out in the back. Well, no hands, I think we're good to go. We're going to conclude the program in just a moment. I want to first thank all of you for being here. Remind you that we will do first-person programs twice a week, Wednesdays and Thursdays through the middle of August. We will soon begin live streaming a number of the programs, I think beginning in April, so you'll be able to pick them up through the internet, and we think that's a very exciting development. Our programs will be heard anywhere for that matter. So join us one way or the other. Come back here or listen over the internet if you can. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So I'm going to turn back to Manny to close our program. When he finishes, Manny will stay up on the stage here. Our photographer, Joel, is going to come up on the stage and take a photograph, and we'll ask you to rise because he's going to take a picture with you as the background to the photograph. And because we didn't have time for more questions, absolutely feel free when we finish to come up on stage and talk with Manny, ask him another question, or just shake his hand if you want to do that. So we welcome you to come up here and do that when we close the program. Manny?
In my presentation to you folks in answers to Bill's questions, I said things like this many times. I said, I don't know if you know, you should know, or you should remember. Working here at the museum for a good number of years now, I find that the knowledge of history is abominable. It's a big word, but that's what it is. So what I'd like to call to your attention is the words of a philosopher historian about 100 years ago. You may know his words, but remember them. I'll have to give you his name as well. Those who do not learn their history well may be deemed or doomed to repeat it or parts of it. And if any of you remember who that was, I will remind you. It was a man by the name of George Santayana, who was teaching in California at the time of Italian extraction. George Santayana said that, and I leave you with the words that say, folks, since we cannot learn from the future, but we can learn from the past, learn the past, learn history, all kinds of history, Holocaust, United States, or anything else, because that's the only thing we can learn from to impact the future. I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you, Manny.